Josh, let's get into kind of a review of Michigan, Ohio State. You picked this game, Ohio State winning closer. I picked Ohio State win by about 14. Um, other than the scoring efficiency issues that I've pointed out and been dragged by Ohio State fans, were you more surprised really with the defense from Ohio State this year or in this game based on what you've seen this year?
I was. Defensively, look, we flagged in our model. I'm going to pull it up here on the fly, but we flagged in our model that there was reasons to be concerned about Ohio State's defensive numbers and defensive efficiency and how much it was sort of a product of the teams they played. 80% of opponent rushing averages is a good, really good number. Not necessarily elite, but a really good number. 91% of opponent passing averages is really average. And my concern, and the reason that I said this would potentially be a close game, is Michigan was right at the threshold of being competent run, competent pass. They were expected to be balanced. I didn't expect them to run as well as they did. And I think it's really interesting, odd. I mean, rivalry games, people always say that they're really unpredictable. The truth is, college football is really unpredictable. Rivalry games are actually a little less unpredictable, but they feel that way because they matter more. And I think people forget how many, like Ohio State nearly losing to Maryland a couple years ago, right? Like how often that actually happens in college football. But when it happens in a rivalry game, we feel like that matters. That was a real game. But here's my thing with Michigan's performance against Ohio State. Last several games, 4.3 yards per carry against Maryland, 3.5 against Penn State, went kind of off for 4.9 against Indiana, but 4.3 against Michigan State, 4.8 against Nebraska. They were under 3 yards per carry against Rutgers and Wisconsin. They've been very up and down all year. And it's interesting to me that they could go in this game and Haskins could average 6 yards a carry. And as a team, they averaged 7.2 yards per carry. It's 2.5 yards over their average, right?
That's wild.
And we talk about this a lot. When you are over your average against a team like Ohio State, which, again, Ohio State's numbers, our model, we're flagging we're not elite, but they are really good. That does say a little bit that they maybe found something Ohio State couldn't defend, and I can't really point to anything in particular in this game. But it also could just be being better prepared, somebody having a bad game. Look, if Ohio State plays their B-plus game and Michigan plays their B-plus game, they are not averaging 7.2 yards per carry. That is a very, very high number. One of the best rushing games Michigan's put up. Not only is it the third best run game that Michigan's put up this year, but it's one of the best run games they put up in years. I'm looking like they had one game better in 2020. This would have been better than any run game in 2019. They had one game better in 2018. This was an elite top end production game for Michigan. And I'm not taking it away from Michigan to say that some of this is maybe preparation for Ohio State, a particular matchup problem, or maybe it's just a bad game for Ohio State, but it definitely got away from them in a manner that I don't think was predictable, or, honestly, I'm not even sure it was really repeatable.
I think the thing that kind of took Ohio State by surprise and was tough to adjust in game was how good McNamara was doing. The run game really came on for them, but early on he was consistent and he was keeping the chains moving. And I think they really hit their stride scoring late in the second quarter into the third quarter. So it wasn't boatloads of points early on, although the interception in the goal line, on the goal line, they could have had even more points. But I think he was the difference maker in that they probably prepped all week a lot for that run game. They did not necessarily expect to have to also defend the pass. And then Ohio State went into and had to go into a too high safety look that they've been doing a lot more since Kerry Coombs is gone, or not calling the plays anymore. But they're more comfortable, I think, in that single high safety look to really affect the run game. And they weren't able to do that because there was enough production from the quarterback to keep them on their heels and keep them having to game plan for that. So I think that was a big deal. On the flip side, Ohio State did the thing that they've been doing all year where, look, I feel like Ohio State, and I said earlier in the show, they can put up 50 points on a good defense, or they can really struggle, but put up the same amount of yards. And that's what they did tonight or today is they put up a whole bunch of yards. But at some point, in I think the fourth quarter, they had like 13 points. And that's the big problem with Ohio State this year we saw it Minnesota, we saw it Oregon, and we're seeing it now, is that those efficiency, bugaboos are still showing up. And Josh, this kind of, want you to touch on this too. Isn't this why you preach we need to look at the whole schedule, and we don't need to be affected by recency bias, and we don't need to be affected by a 4-game stretch where we don't play anybody and things look better? Week 1 to week 12, yes, you can improve or get bad over that course of time, get worse, but it's still within the same season. So there is something to those data points.
Yeah, when you look at Ohio State's season this year, right, in rush defense, they've been under 5 yards of carry from opponents all year. The one exception was Purdue. They didn't run it very much. They were about 4.8. But other than that game, they had been holding teams under 3.6 yards per carry since Oregon. And what did they do against Oregon? They gave up 7.1 yards per carry. And we feel like, well, that Oregon game was week 2. There were other problems. We changed defensive coordinator, yada, yada. Something I kept flagging, Coombs' scheme to me was flawed in large part because that single high safety made things really tough on their corners. I didn't have a problem with a single high safety look versus the run. That's the one thing it should be good at. So there were issues with them maintaining the edge in Oregon and some other things, but getting run over was not a good look by Ohio State against Oregon. And I think a lot of those same things came out, especially in terms of that defensive line. Just to be blunt, it's just not as good as people wanted to make them out to be preseason. I think that just has to be accepted at this point. And the other thing that we talked about all year, and you talk about recency bias, Ohio State with their receiving core was really, really boom or bust. If they can get the ball to the receivers, I tweeted this during the game, they could put up a number, right? But if teams could get pressure and they could get Stroud off his mark, and especially if they could affect the run game, Ohio State started getting really sputtery. They started getting really herky-jerky, and teams could play bend but don't break, let them get to the red zone, or let them start getting midfield and then stop them once they got out of RPO kill zone range. And I think that all repeated itself. I think Stroud has played much, much better at the end of the year, but there were still several throws throughout that game that he plain missed, because if he starts getting pressure, he doesn't set his feet properly. He's a first-time starter. A lot of guys, Bryce Young, who was the same Heisman conversation, had the same problem. Stroud looked better today than Young did. Let me be clear. But you still have that problem. And those are the things that I had seen from Ohio State all season. And I always said, these are the nits that I pick if you want to win a championship, if you want to win the playoff, because those nits show up in a game like number 5 Michigan. And, you throw for 394 yards, 2 touchdowns, 34-49 passing, and you lose at 8 yards per attempt. I think it's interesting as an aside. I made the Bryce Young comparison. I'm just going to make this in passing. Alabama had 388 yards of offense and only 24 points. Ohio State had 458 yards of offense and only 27 points. As little as Alabama produced at times, Ohio State scored 3 more points. And I know there's OT, but they didn't really get a lot of points in OT because it was a new format, right? And I know they only scored, 10 in regulation. But the point being, Ohio State all year long has struggled to convert yards to points. Early in the year, they showed that the defensive line had some deficiencies. And so if you look at the entire season, I think all those things really came home to roost.
Yeah. I also just want to give credit to Michigan. I mean,
and I'm about to say, I want to turn this conversation to be positive on Michigan because I don't want to leave that out.
Well, and this is not like, we're not saying this retroactively. Like we've been saying all year, starting about the middle of the year, and now it's confirmed, but we said going into this game, even though we picked Ohio State, that this is Jim Harbaugh's best coaching job that we can remember in a really long time. And probably ever at Michigan. And I say this, I opened the show crediting McNamara, but he's still not an elite quarterback. He's not a top 5, maybe top 10, but I don't think so. Quarterback, he's good, not great. And knowing that, and knowing the turnover he's had at defensive coordinator and with Gaddis at offensive coordinator, it's a credit to him and what he's done. And I know you say that he's kind of caught a little bit of luck in how the old school model is working a little more this year than it has in the past. But either way, he's earned a chance to have a very winnable game and be in the playoffs. And that deserves unbelievable credit after coming off, a not great year last year and maybe a disappointing year the year before. He got the Ohio State monkey off his back. And they're probably ready to offer him a lifetime contract at this point. But talk a little bit about the job he's done this year.
Yeah, I think it's hard for people to take the positivity stuff away that they should. I just made up a word for Michigan because of the way the schedule went, right? Like Western Michigan, Washington wasn't nearly as good as they were expected to be this year. Northern Illinois, they had what should have been a marquee team to begin the year, didn't end up being that way. And then you have Rutgers. And even though they're winning a lot of those games big, nobody really took major positive away from it. And then you have like the struggle against Rutgers, and you have a good win against a Wisconsin team that wasn't ranked at the time, close win against Nebraska. And people were, I think, sort of skittish. And I think maybe somewhat rightly so that Rutgers close game doesn't look great in retrospect. Rutgers was playing good football at the time, but Nebraska, whatever. And then that Michigan State loss just felt like validation. But you look at it afterwards, and you blow out Indiana, you beat Penn State, you destroy Maryland, you blow out Ohio State. We talk about the totality of the season. Look, it's not just recency bias. There are a lot of signs that Michigan is a good football team. I think they had struggles when Bell went out. It took them a while to sort of get resettled. They lost a game to Michigan State that they were kind of almost in control of at one point. And that we all kind of wrote them off. But in my view with Michigan, they managed a not great quarterback situation. They managed an injury to by far their best wide receiver in Bell, which would have been devastating to a lot of teams. I mean, if Ohio State lost, I mean, they've got three great receivers, I know, but if they lost Olave, they would not have been the same team even. And then they paired it by having a great run game with, Corum, who got hurt a bunch, and then Haskins, who was dominant. And then the defense this year was so much better than it had been from a consistency basis versus when it was in Don Brown. Clearly scaled a lot better, was always our complaint, lack of scaling. Across the board, I think Michigan was really an underrated team. I think Michigan still has their limitations. I think they're going to struggle in a game where if Ohio State had put up, like a lot of points early, if they've been struggling, Michigan probably would have been maybe out of their game plan a little bit. And I'm not sure how patient you can be. But the brand of football they're playing this year, which a lot of it runs through like a Jabo and Hutchinson is an absolute dude. It's just good winning football. And in a year where, and let me make this point before I turn it back to you. I've said to you, I know on and off air a number of times, this season was a little bit of a throwback. And I don't know if it's a 1 year thing or if it's a change in the way defenses are able to play offenses. But I think it benefited Michigan to a large extent because the things that Michigan does and wants to do and the style of football Harbaugh wants to play, which is efficiency-based, consistency offense, I think worked in a year where there weren't teams that could regularly put up over 40 points a game. And you combine that with an offense that has modernized some under Gaddis, and you ended up with a really, really good team that was well built for what you needed to be in 2021 to win and has absolutely in front of them a shot to play in the playoff.
Yeah, and our resident Bama knucklehead is in the chat causing a stir, dragging Hutchinson. And I'm gonna say right now, like that tells me that Horatio hasn't watched the tape. And because Will Anderson, I think, is the best player in the country. I'm on record as saying it. I think that if I were filling out a Heisman ballot, Will Anderson would have my number one vote. I think he is the best player for Alabama, the best player in the country. And if he were draft eligible, would be number one overall. If you watch that game today, Hutchinson jumped off the tape. Like, and not just in see quarterback, get quarterback. Like he almost got his hand on that final score screenplay, bailing in coverage after he recognized it. Like he's a great elite football player. He's a top 5 draft pick quality football player. And I think that he hasn't gotten his due this year, even though people love him. And people down here in SEC country don't give him enough credit. I think if I were writing a ballot, he would be my number 2 on the list. Like, I would have him in New York City as well. And I wish people would give him his due.
Agreed. I think one of the things that happens, and you see it in our chat a lot, you see it in our comment section. Frankly, people don't have time to watch football of every game around the country. Like, for me to be able to do this and sit and talk to you guys right now, I'm watching 5 games at a time all day today. It's kind of exhausting. I mean, you can tell we're tired, but I think people just don't recognize how good Hutchinson is. I think a lot of people in Big Ten country don't realize how good Anderson is. And when you start
Right.
making those comparisons and they're like, well, he's clearly better because he has this number. No, he's clearly better. And this guy sucks, blah, blah, blah. They're both phenomenal football players. Phenomenal football players. Anderson would be the best defensive player in a lot of years. That's the thing I think people miss. Hutchinson might be the best football player in years where you don't have someone quite like Anderson. Anderson's like on a Chase Young, statistically, absolutely on a Chase Young level. Statistically, actually, a little better than Young's best year right now. But Hutchinson absolutely is a dude. That Michigan defense is absolutely legitimately great, and they're a very physical team on offense. And I think Ohio State ran into that with a team that is very modern, but Young had a lot of turnover at key positions, and defensive side of the ball that for whatever reason just didn't gel this year. And when you put all that all together, the consistent, steady hand at Michigan finally was able to break the curse and break the streak.
All right. So as we wind this down, and Stephen Light is still in the house. I see him still chatting. So hello to him. Just in terms of Michigan's season forward, like, have they accomplished enough this year that even if they lost their next 2 games, it really doesn't matter because they've had a great year to this point? Or have they gotten a little taste, Josh? And now if they don't make some noise in the playoffs, they're going to be really disappointed.
I think it's an interesting question. I don't really know, okay, and there's always a delay, but you Michigan fans, as we wrap up here, put in the comments, really, not your hype version where you're trying to speak things into existence, but what is your real take on where Michigan is at? And if you're watching this later, tell us in the comment section. Do you think, or do you have an expectation for Michigan to play in the playoffs? And let's assume you don't play Georgia in week 1. Do you expect to win your first playoff game if it's against Cincinnati or Oklahoma State or Alabama? Like, what is your reasonable expectation? I don't know where it's at for Michigan because I think they were much more focused on beating Ohio State, and I think they're just now turning their attention to the idea of the playoff. But right now, man, you still got to beat Iowa, and I don't think that's a given. So let's put one foot in front of the other, and I think that's where, if I were a Michigan fan, I think that's where my mind would be right now.
Yeah, I mean, it is when you play a team with an elite something on one side of the ball or the other, which I think Iowa's defense is borderline elite. There is a chance you could lose. So I think that's the thing that they got to fight now because they're on this super high and they're playing a team that has some losses. And there is this pull to not be super focused and prepared because you're already thinking playoffs and you're already thinking matchups and that sort of thing. But 2 things. I think one, they're this close to a conference title, which I think there would probably be a tinge of disappointment if they don't win their conference this year, given that they crested the Ohio State mountain. But I guarantee you that this offseason, after the momentary sting of that loss went away, if they got blown out in the first round of the playoffs, and I'm not saying they will, we're talking hypotheticals because that's what we do. I think they could still walk away extremely satisfied, deservingly so, they should, with what they did this season. And maybe that's me speaking as someone who's not a Michigan fan, but I think that will be the case. Josh, anything else as we wind this up? You said 90 minutes. We've gone a little more than that. As we wind this up, maybe a parting shot for what you saw and what we learned today.
Well, here's my parting shot is UTSA lost 45-23 to North Texas, who's a 6-6 team in the G5. And I just want to rub my temples when we talk about teams that have schedules where you can have closest wins to like Southern. We talked about 2 weeks ago, right? 27-17 to Southern Miss was a really bad sign. And 31-28 Memphis. They had a lot of close games. One score win over UNLV. This is a year where you've got to put behind you your thought process that wins and losses are the be all end all. And if you want to talk about a team or why they're good or bad, you need to actually pull up that team schedule, look for every win and loss on that team schedule, and then do the research to find out how good those teams are before you crack on them. Because there's a lot of parity. A lot of teams have had stupid or weird losses, but the parity that exists within the Big Ten and within the SEC is totally different than the parity that exists within Conference USA or within the Big 12. It's just not the same, I think, this year. And with a lot of conferences, and we've been dinging the Big 12 all night on this, not playing out of conference games against P5 teams and choosing to be isolated, I think people have a little bit of blinders to that. And I think that to me is really the story of 2021 coming out of 2020 where we didn't have out of conference games. And I thought 2021 would be better. And I think we're still in the same boat. And I think, assuming we actually have more bowls, I really feel like we're sort of in for a lot of shocking results.
Yeah, and the UTSA note is funny because they needed a miracle last week to beat UAB, and it just shows you the disparity between the kind of world that the G5 operates in, the average G5. I'm not talking about Cincinnati. The average G5 operates in, and they get infinite credit for wins that Power 5 teams get actually punished for if they don't blow them out. And I think that we're pretending the emperor has no clothes. We're pretending that that dichotomy doesn't exist. And that for one group of people, a win is a win is a win. And for the other group of people, when they play the team you beat that you got credit for, but they don't blow them out, we're going to drop them in the polls. And I just don't think that's right. And we're being asked to participate in a rain dance, and I hate it. All right, y'all, let us know anything you want in the comments. If you've hung on this long after live show and you're watching this in the replay, podcasters, we're thankful so much for you for listening as well. We got a ton of content coming out this week. Previews, obviously it's championship week. We're going to be talking a lot of football, so keep an eye out for that. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great weekend, and God bless.